Welcome to the Rugby Obsession Podcast. If you're as hooked on rugby as we are, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss out on any of our future deep dives.
Yeah, we've got a juicy one for you today.
Definitely juicy, and maybe a little controversial too. You know, we always love to dig into the big talking points in rugby, and, well, after those recent comments from Fabien Galthié about the refereeing in that France-Ireland game, we just had to dive straight in.
Yeah, that whole situation with Antoine Dupont's injury and Galthier's reaction, and then Brian Moore weighing in with his column in the Telegraph, it's got everyone talking.
So let's break it down, shall we? For those who might have missed it, Galthié didn't hold back after Dupont got injured.
No, he didn't. He was pretty critical of the ref, Angus Gardner, for not penalizing Ireland's Andrew Porter and Tag Byrne in the lead-up to the incident. He even went so far as to say that he'd cited both players, but that nothing came of it.
Which, raises some interesting questions about the whole citing process, but also, I think, about the role of coaches and how they respond to these kind of high-pressure, high-stakes situations.
Absolutely. And Brian Moore, being the outspoken legend that he is, well, he really went for it in his Telegraph column, didn't he? He called out Galthié for official blaming, basically saying he was trying to shift the blame and put pressure on referees.
And I think what makes Moore's perspective so valuable here is that he's not just some commentator on the sidelines. The man's a former England international. He's been there, done that, and he knows just how tough refereeing can be.
Oh, absolutely. And he's also got a really keen eye for the nuances of the game and how these kinds of comments can impact things. You know, one of the points that really stood out to me in his column was how he picked apart Galthier's post-match statements. Galthié was very careful not to explicitly say he was trying to influence the referee, but Moore argued that by publicly describing the actions that led to Dupont's injury as reprehensible, well, he was doing exactly that.
Right. It's a very fine line, isn't it? Because, of course, a coach is going to be concerned about their players' well-being, but where's the line between expressing concern and trying to influence future decisions?
Exactly. And Moore makes this really interesting comparison between Galthier's reaction and the way Ireland's stand-in coach, Simon Easterby, responded. Easterby just called it a rugby incident.
Totally different approach, right?
Yeah. And you have to wonder what the thinking is behind these different responses. Was Easterby trying to just, downplay things and avoid controversy?
Yeah.
Was Galthié trying to, I don't know, maybe get in the refs' heads for the future? It's fascinating stuff.
Oh, absolutely. And if you're finding this fascinating too, and you want more deep dives into the world of rugby, make sure you hit that subscribe button to keep up with Rugby Obsession.
So Moore's point, and it's a big one, is that this focus on the officials isn't good for the game as a whole. And he doesn't just single out Galthié. He points to a wider trend of coaches increasingly criticizing referees publicly.
Yeah. He brought up Rassie Erasmus, didn't he? And the whole thing with his social media posts about refereeing decisions.
Yep. Moore actually compared Erasmus to Donald Trump with that just asking questions approach.
It's a pretty strong comparison, I thought. But I get where he's coming from.
Right. Because it might seem harmless on the surface, just asking questions, but it can really undermine confidence in referees, especially when it's amplified on social media. And suddenly you've got everyone and their dog scrutinizing every single decision, which makes an already difficult job even harder.
It's true. And, it's not just after the game that this happens. Moore also brought up those pre-match comments from Steve Borthwick to Ben O'Keefe, the ref for England's game against Ireland. Borthwick told him to be sharp at the breakdown, which, on the face of it, seems pretty standard, right?
Yeah, you could just see it as a coach, prepping the ref. But Moore sees it differently. He thinks that even if it's subtle, that kind of pre-match reminder can be a tactic to influence the ref, maybe get them to penalize the other team more at the breakdown.
It's like just planting a little seed of doubt, right?
Exactly. And it shows you how even seemingly innocent comments can be part of a bigger strategy. And it makes you think, how much of this goes on behind the scenes, the stuff we don't see?
It really does. And that's why Moore's getting so worried about all of this. He thinks it's creating this culture of negativity around refereeing, which is ultimately going to damage the game.
Yeah. He's worried about the long-term consequences, like it's already tough enough to attract and retain good referees, and who's going to want to do the job if they're constantly being criticized and second-guessed?
Exactly. And he doesn't let World Rugby off the hook either. He basically says they need to step up and do more to protect refs.
He's calling for a review of those pre- and post-match protocols, what coaches are allowed to say. He acknowledges that World Rugby has taken action in the past, like with Erasmus, but his point is that the rules just aren't clear enough right now.
Right. And without clear rules and consistent enforcement, Moore thinks this whole thing's just going to keep escalating. These controversies are going to keep getting artificially inflamed, as he put it.
And that's a real shame because then the focus shifts away from the actual game, the players, the skills, the athleticism, all the things we love about rugby, and instead it's all about the refereeing.
It's true. It just sucks the joy out of it.
Absolutely. And it creates this negative atmosphere, not just on the pitch, but among the fans, too.
Now, this whole situation with Galthié, Erasmus, Borthwick, and how they interact with officiating, it's actually a perfect example of what you were talking about earlier, that interest you have in the impact of different personalities and leadership styles.
Oh, yeah, it's fascinating, isn't it? You've got these high-profile coaches all under immense pressure, and they're all dealing with it in their own way. And their interactions with the officials and the way they talk about it publicly, it reveals so much about their leadership styles.
So the big question is, what's the motivation behind it all? Are they just playing mind games? Is it genuine concern for their players? Or is it a bit of both?
I think it's probably a mix, to be honest. I mean, these guys are competitors, right? They want to win, so they're going to try to gain any advantage they can. But at the same time, you can't dismiss the genuine frustration they feel, especially when a player gets injured. Like with Galthié and Dupont, that was a tough one to watch.
Yeah, it was. So it's a tricky situation, isn't it? How do we hold referees accountable without creating this toxic environment where they're constantly under attack?
That's the million-dollar question, right? I think ultimately it's about finding that balance, respecting the difficult job referees have, while also ensuring fairness and the integrity of the game.
So that was our deep dive into Brian Moore's thoughts on coaches' comments on refereeing. And as you can tell, it's a pretty complex issue with no easy answers.
What we do know is that this conversation isn't going away anytime soon. And it's a conversation worth having because it touches on some really fundamental aspects of rugby, like what kind of sport do we want it to be?
We'd love to hear your thoughts on this, so head over to the comments and tell us what you think. Do you think coaches are crossing a line with their public comments? And what role should World Rugby play in all of this?
Don't forget to subscribe to Rugby Obsession so you don't miss out on future deep dives. And also check out the show notes for links to Brian Moore's column and other resources.
Thanks for listening to the Rugby Obsession podcast. We look forward to you listening to our next episode.